In 1258, the city of Baghdad burned. The waters of the Tigris River ran red with the blood of thousands of victims. The Mongols, under command of Hulagu Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, had just conquered the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, one of the most important cultural and knowledge centers in human history. Libraries that held centuries of knowledge were destroyed. The House of Wisdom, where scholars of all religions gathered to discuss philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy, was reduced to ashes. The last Abbasid Caliph was brutally executed, rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, as the Mongols believed it was bad luck to spill royal blood directly on the ground. The Islamic world was in a state of complete shock. The city that had been the beating heart of civilization for over 500 years now lay in ruins. But this was not just another Mongol conquest. It was a continuation of a campaign of terror that had begun decades earlier on the steppes of Central Asia. The Mongols were not simply conquerors. They were a force of nature, a military machine so efficient and brutal that it seemed unstoppable. They had destroyed thousand-year-old empires, killed entire populations, and created an empire that stretched from the Pacific coast to the borders of Eastern Europe. Cities that dared resist were completely destroyed, their populations massacred to the last man, woman, and child as a warning to others who would consider challenging Mongol power. The very word Mongol had become the same as inevitable destruction. Now, after the fall of Baghdad, the Mongols turned their eyes westward. Syria lay in their path. Aleppo fell quickly, followed by Damascus. The ancient cities that had witnessed a rise and fall of empires over thousands of years now bowed before the horsemen of the steppes. Hulagu Khan sent ambassadors to Egypt with a clear and terrifying message. The letter stated that the Mamluk Sultan must submit immediately or face the same fate as all those who had dared resist the Mongols. The message left no room for interpretation. It was either total submission or complete destruction. If you're enjoying this content, subscribe to the channel and comment below what time you watched this video. Let's continue this incredible story. Egypt, ruled by the Mamluks, was in an extremely delicate position. The Mamluks were a unique military class in history. The word Mamluk literally means slave. But these were no ordinary slaves. They were elite warriors purchased at a young age, usually from regions such as the Caucasus, Anatolia, and the Black Sea steppes. These boys were taken to Egypt, converted to Islam, and put through tough military training that lasted years. They learned not only the arts of war, but also received education in administration, politics, and religion. When they completed their training, they were freed and became members of an extremely loyal and tight-knit military elite. The fascinating paradox was that although technically freed, they remained united by bonds of loyalty stronger than any chain. They formed a military brotherhood that eventually seized power in Egypt and established its own dynasty. The leader of the Mamluks at that critical moment was Qutuz. He had recently assumed power under turbulent circumstances following the death of the previous sultan. Qutuz was himself a refugee. He had been captured as a child during the Mongol invasions of Central Asia and sold into slavery. Ironically, the man who would now face the Mongols had lost everything to them as a young man. His family had been killed, his homeland destroyed, and he had been dragged into a life of slavery. But through the Mamluk system, he had transformed from a slave into one of the most formidable warriors of his generation, and was now the Sultan of Egypt. Few men in history understood the Mongol threat better than Qutuz. He had no illusions about what was to come. When the Mongol ambassadors arrived in Cairo with their demands for submission, the Mamluk court was divided. Many advisors argued that resistance would be suicidal. After all, what had happened to all the others who tried? The Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most formidable powers in Central Asia, had been completely destroyed. The Jin dynasty in China had fallen after decades of bloody resistance. The Principality of Kiev and other Russian lands had been devastated. Poland and Hungary had been invaded and were only spared total conquest because the Mongols decided to return to Asia after the death of the Great Khan. Empire after empire, army after army had all been crushed under the hooves of Mongol horses. Why should Egypt be any different? But Qutuz made a decision that shocked many. He had the Mongol ambassadors executed. In medieval diplomacy, killing ambassadors was considered one of the greatest possible violations of international norms. It was an act that guaranteed all-out war with no possibility of negotiation or mercy. The Mongols were particularly sensitive to such offenses. when the Shah of the Khwarezmian Empire had executed Mongol merchants and ambassadors decades earlier. Genghis Khan personally led a campaign of revenge that resulted in the complete destruction of that empire. Qutuz knew exactly what he was doing. He was burning all bridges. There would be no submission, no negotiation, no retreat. It would be victory or death. By executing the ambassadors, Qutuz was sending a message not only to the Mongols, but also to his own people. They would fight come what may. But Qutuz was no fool. He knew that mere courage would not be enough against the Mongols. History was full of courageous warriors who had been slaughtered by the armies of the steppes. The Mongols didn't win simply because they were ferocious. They won because they were extraordinarily well-organized, disciplined, and tactically superior. To defeat the Mongols, the Mamluks would need more than bravery. They would need strategy, intelligence, and above all, they would need to use the Mongols' own weapons and tactics against them. To understand the magnitude of the challenge the Mamluks faced, we must understand exactly what made the Mongol army so devastatingly effective. The Mongols had revolutionized warfare in ways the world had not seen since the time of Alexander the Great. Their army was built around cavalry archers, a lethal combination few enemies knew how to counter. Every Mongol warrior was essentially a highly trained mounted archer from childhood. Mongol children learned to ride before they could walk properly and began training with archery at the age of 4 or 5. By 15, a young Mongol was already a veteran in terms of equestrian and archery skills. The Mongol composite bow was a masterpiece of engineering. Made of wood, horn, and sinew, bonded in layers and left to cure for years, this bow could fire arrows over 200 meters with lethal force. But the true genius lay in how the Mongols used it. They could fire with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed, turning in the saddle to fire backward, a technique known as Parthian shooting. Picture the scene. An enemy army advances, confident of its numerical superiority. Suddenly, the Mongols appear, a cloud of horsemen rapidly approaching. The enemy prepares for close combat. But before they can engage, the Mongols unleash a devastating volley of arrows and immediately retreat. When the enemy tries to pursue, the Mongols fire backward as they flee, inflicting even more casualties. This cycle of attack and retreat could continue for hours, bleeding the enemy until their formations fall apart in frustration and exhaustion. But Mongol tactical superiority went far beyond their individual combat skills. They had developed a military communication system centuries ahead of its time. Using flags, drums, and even special arrows that whistled as they flew, Mongol commanders could coordinate the complex movements of thousands of horsemen in the midst of battle. Their formations could split, reform, flank, and execute pincer maneuvers with a precision that left their enemies completely baffled. While European and Middle Eastern armies often fought as disorganized masses of individual warriors seeking personal glory, the Mongols operated like a perfectly coordinated machine. Mongol military intelligence was equally impressive. They sent spies and scouts long before their major campaigns. Mongol merchants traveled to the land to be invaded, mapping routes, identifying strongholds, and assessing the strength of enemy armies. By the time they finally attacked, the Mongols already knew more about the enemy territory than many of the defenders themselves. They studied their adversaries' weaknesses, exploited political divisions, and used psychological warfare to devastating effect. The Mongol reputation for brutality was in part a deliberate weapon. When a city heard how Baghdad had been destroyed, with pyramids of skulls erected as monuments to futile resistance, the will to fight often evaporated. The Mongols were also masters at taking technology and knowledge from their conquered enemies. When they invaded China, they captured engineers and learned the art of siege warfare. Suddenly, a steppe people who traditionally avoided walled cities were using catapults, siege towers, and even primitive explosives. Chinese, Persian, and Arab engineers were forced to serve in the Mongol armies, bringing with them centuries of military knowledge. This adaptability made the Mongols even more dangerous. They had no pride to prevent them from adopting their enemies' best practices. If something worked, they incorporated it immediately. Furthermore, Mongol logistics were revolutionary. Each Mongol horseman traveled with several spare horses, usually 4 or 5. This meant they could cover enormous distances without tiring their mounts. While traditional armies march about 15 to 20 kilometers per day, the Mongols could easily cover double or triple that distance. They lived on dairy products, dried meat, and horse blood when necessary, requiring far fewer supplies than conventional armies. This mobility and self-sufficiency allowed them to appear in places the enemy never expected and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. It was mobile warfare brought to perfection. So when Kutus and the Mamluks looked north to Mongol-occupied Syria, they knew they would face not just an army but an entire war machine honed over generations. However, the Mamluks had some crucial advantages that other Mongol adversaries lacked. First, they themselves were elite warriors specialized in mounted combat. Unlike feudal European armies or Middle Eastern infantry formations, the Mamluks were professional horsemen who trained constantly. They practiced horse archery, mounted spear and sword combat, and complex cavalry tactics. In terms of individual skill, the Mamluks were far closer to the Mongols than any other army the steppe nomads had faced previously. Second, the Mamluks had something many of the Mongols' adversaries lacked: recent experience in intense combat. They had spent decades fighting in the Crusades against the Crusader states in the Levant. These were no minor conflicts. They were brutal, prolonged campaigns against heavily armed European knights and fanatical military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers. The Mamluks had learned to face and defeat heavy cavalry, to take fortified castles, and to operate in desert conditions that would kill most other armies. They were battle-tested in ways that forged an extremely competent and adaptable army. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the Mamluks were fighting to defend their own land. For the Mongols, this was yet another campaign in a long series of conquests. For the Mamluks, it was an existential struggle. Losing would mean not only the death of their warriors, but the complete destruction of their state, their families, and everything they had built. This psychological difference should not be underestimated. The Mongols were professional warriors motivated by loyalty, discipline, and the promise of plunder. The Mamluks were fighting for survival. Kutus immediately began mobilizing his army. He summoned all available Mamluk warriors from across Egypt, but he also made a controversial decision that demonstrated his pragmatic determination. He released one of his political rivals, a Mamluk general named Baibars, who had been forced into exile after political intrigue. Baibars was recognized as one of the most brilliant military commanders of his generation. He had been a key leader in the Mamluk victories against the Crusaders and possessed a deep understanding of tactics and strategy. Kutu set aside his personal differences and recalled Baibars, offering him a high-level command in the army that would march against the Mongols. It was a gesture from a leader who understood that defeating the Mongols was more important than personal politics. Meanwhile, in the north, Hulagu Khan faced his own challenges. News had arrived from Mongolia about the death of his brother, the great Khan monkey. This triggered a succession crisis in the Mongol Empire. Hulagu, as one of the most powerful princes in the family, had a stake in the dispute. He decided to return to Mongolia with the bulk of his army, leaving only a force of about 20,000 men in Syria under the command of one of his best generals, Kitbuka. Kitbuka was a veteran of the Mongol Wars and a highly competent commander. He was also an Nestorian Christian, which added an interesting dimension to the conflict, as some local Christians in Syria initially saw the Mongols as potential allies against the Muslims. 20,000 Mongol horsemen was still a formidable force, but significantly smaller than the more than 100,000 Hulagu had commanded in the conquest of Baghdad. More importantly, it meant the Mamluks would not be facing the full force of the Mongol Empire, but rather an expeditionary force. The odds still favored the Mongols based on their reputation and track record, but the margin had narrowed considerably. Kutus assembled some 20,000 Mamluk warriors with perhaps another 10,000 auxiliaries from Bedouin Arab tribes who had joined the cause. The numbers were roughly even, a rarity in Mongol engagements where they often prevailed despite being outnumbered. In the summer of 1260, the Mamluk army marched out of Egypt and into Sinai. The march itself was a formidable logistical challenge. Crossing the Sinai Desert with an army of 30,000 men and tens of thousands of horses required careful planning. Water wells needed to be identified and protected. Supplies needed to be transported through dry terrain. But the Mamluks were veterans of desert operations, and the march proceeded in an organized manner. When they reached Palestine, Kutus made a crucial strategic decision. Instead of advancing directly into Mongol-held territory in Syria, he sought a battlefield that favored his tactics. He chose a valley called ʿAin Jalut, meaning Spring of Goliath, a biblically resonant name located near the modern city of Nazareth. The valley had specific geographic features that Kutus planned to exploit. It was surrounded by hills and had limited room for large-scale maneuvers. This would partially neutralize the Mongol advantage in long-range mobile warfare. The Mongols were masters of using vast open plains for their flanking and encirclement tactics. In more confined terrain, their options would be more limited. Furthermore, the valley had vegetation and terrain features that would allow part of the Mamluk army to hide and prepare ambushes. Kutus then implemented a bold psychological strategy. He sent a smaller advance force commanded by Baibars to provoke the Mongols and lure them into the valley. This was an extraordinarily risky move. If the Mongols suspected a trap, they could simply refuse battle on disadvantageous terrain. Worse, if Baibars' force were annihilated before they could retreat into the trap, the plan would fall apart. But Kutus bet correctly on Mongol confidence. Kitbuka, upon hearing that a Mamluk army had entered Syria, immediately mobilized his forces to intercept them. The Mongols had never lost a major pitched battle. They had no reason to fear the Mamluks, who were just another enemy in a long line of defeated adversaries. Early in the morning of September 3rd, 1260, Baibars' advance forces encountered the Mongols near ʿAin Jalut. As planned, Baibars engaged the Mongols in skirmishes, exchanging arrows and making small charges before retreating. The Mongols, recognizing what appeared to be a retreating enemy, pursued. This was a tactic the Mongols knew well, having used it frequently. Feigning retreat to lure the enemy into a trap was a favorite Mongol maneuver. But Kitbuka, confident in his superiority, believed the Mamluks were genuinely retreating in panic before the Mongol cavalry. Perhaps he believed that Mongol reputation alone had broken the Mamluk will to fight. Or perhaps he simply underestimated his adversaries, as so many others had done before their defeat by the Mongols. As Baibars retreated deeper into the valley, the Mongols followed, their forces stretching as they pursued what appeared to be fleeing enemies. And then, when the Mongols were trapped in the valley, Kutus gave a signal. Suddenly, from behind the hills and vegetation on the valley sides, thousands of Mamluk horsemen emerged. The Mongols found themselves surrounded on three sides. The Mongol rear guard was cut off by Mamluk forces that had been waiting in hiding. For the first time in decades of conquest, a Mongol army was trapped. But the Mongols were not an army easily panicked. Kitbuka immediately began reorganizing his forces, attempting to break the siege and regain the initiative. What followed was one of the most brutal and intense battles of the medieval era. For hours, the two elite cavalry armies clashed in the valley. Arrows filled the sky in clouds so dense that, according to some chronicles, they resembled swarms of locusts. The sound of thousands of thundering hooves, the whistling of arrows, the screams of wounded men and horses, the clash of weapons, all created deafening chaos. The Mongols, even trapped, fought with a ferocity and discipline that had made them so fearsome. They formed defensive circles of cavalry, their formations maintaining cohesion even under massive attack. Kitbuka personally led several countercharges, attempting to create openings in the Mamluk lines. At several points, it seemed as if the Mongols might actually break the siege. But the Mamluks did not retreat. They had trained their entire lives for this type of combat. Every Mamluk warrior was, like the Mongols, an elite mounted archer. They could match the Mongols arrow for arrow. And in close combat, the Mamluks were as skilled as their opponents. Here was the secret weapon mentioned in the title of this video. It wasn't a physical weapon. It wasn't a new technology. It wasn't a mysterious device. It was something much more fundamental. The secret weapon was that the Mamluks had carefully studied the Mongols themselves. They had learned Mongol tactics, trained to counter them, and crucially, created conditions where the Mongols' greatest strength, mobility, and large-scale maneuverability were neutralized. The Mamluks used geography, strategy, and the Mongol playbook itself against them. They lured the Mongols into a trap using the feigned retreat that the Mongols themselves made famous. They turned Mongol confidence into arrogance against them. But there was more. The Mamluks possessed something few armies that faced the Mongols possessed: unshakable morale. They knew they could not retreat. Kutus had executed the Mongol ambassadors. There would be no mercy if they lost. Every Mamluk warrior understood that this battle would determine not only the fate of Egypt, but possibly the entire Islamic world. Stories of Baghdad, Aleppo, Damascus, all the cities destroyed by the Mongols, circulated among the troops. They knew exactly what would happen to their families, their cities, their people if they failed here. This determination was felt on the battlefield. As the battle continued, the terrain increasingly worked against the Mongols. The valley, which limited their maneuver options, also made it impossible for them to execute their classic retreat and regroup tactic. They were trapped in a grinding battle, exactly the kind of fighting they usually avoided. The Mamluks, on the other hand, were fighting exactly as they had planned. Their lines held firm, their reserves were committed at the right moments, and their discipline remained intact even under the intense pressure of combat against Mongols. Kutus demonstrated exceptional leadership throughout the battle. Reports say that at a critical moment when part of his line appeared to be failing under a particularly fierce Mongol charge, he removed his helmet so everyone could see his face and shouted, "W.A. Islama! Oh my Islam!" He then personally led a charge to stabilize the line. Seeing their commander, the Sultan himself, fighting alongside them inspired the Mamluk warriors to stand firm. This was no battle commanded from afar by nobles secure on some distant hill. It was a desperate struggle where leaders bled alongside their men. As the day progressed, the battle turned decisively against the Mongols. Their casualties mounted. Their formation fell apart under the relentless pressure, and their strategic options narrowed. Kitbuka, recognizing the battle was lost, attempted to mount a final defensive position. According to some sources, when offered surrender, he scornfully refused, saying he would rather die than surrender. Kitbuka was killed in the ensuing battle, fighting to the bitter end. With the death of their commander, Mongol resistance finally fell apart. Some Mongol warriors managed to escape the onslaught, fleeing north, but most were killed or captured. When silence finally descended on the ʿAin Jalut Valley that night, the impossible had happened. The Mongol army, which had been considered invincible for over 50 years, had been destroyed in open battle. The bodies of thousands of Mongol warriors, men who had conquered from China to the gates of Vienna, lay scattered throughout the valley. The legend of Mongol invincibility had been shattered. What this meant for the world is difficult to overstate. News of the victory at ʿAin Jalut spread like wildfire throughout the Islamic world. Cities that had surrendered to the Mongols suddenly rose in rebellion. Mongol garrisons in Syria were attacked and massacred. Within weeks, the Mongols were driven out of Syria and forced a retreat to Mesopotamia. The Mongol advance westward had been permanently stopped. Never again would the Mongols attempt to conquer Egypt or advance further south in the Middle East. From a long-term historical perspective, ʿAin Jalut is one of the most significant battles in world history. Had the Mamluks lost, it is entirely possible that the Mongols would have conquered Egypt, destroyed Mecca and Medina, Islam's holiest sites, and potentially advanced into North Africa. The course of history would have been fundamentally altered. Instead, ʿAin Jalut established the limits of the Mongol Empire. It demonstrated that they were not, in fact, invincible, that they could be defeated by an opponent who understood their tactics and could match their skill. The battle also cemented the Mamluk Sultanate as the great power of the Middle East. The Mamluks would continue to rule Egypt and much of the Levant for the next 260 years, until the Ottoman conquest in 1517. They would become the protectors of Islam's holy sites and the leaders of the Sunni Islamic world. Ironically, the Mamluk system of military slaves turned ruling elite proved remarkably durable and effective. But the personal stories of the protagonists of ʿAin Jalut had tragic and violent outcomes. Kutus, the man who had saved Egypt and perhaps the Islamic world from the Mongols, did not live to enjoy his triumph for long. Just weeks after the battle, as the army returned to Egypt, Kutus was assassinated by Baibars and other Mamluk conspirators. The exact reasons remain debated among historians. Some suggest it was due to personal ambition, others that it was because Kutus had promised to return lands to their original owners that Baibars and others had received as a reward. Regardless of the motivation, Baibars assumed the Sultanate and will become one of the most effective and feared rulers in Mamluk history. He spent the next decades consolidating Mamluk power, driving the last crusaders from the Holy Land, and transforming Egypt into the region's dominant superpower. For the Mongols, ʿAin Jalut was a traumatic shock. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a humiliation. A Mongol army had been destroyed in open battle by adversaries they had underestimated. This had repercussions throughout the Mongol Empire. The aura of invincibility that had been so crucial to their conquest was shattered. Other nations and peoples who had considered resistance futile now so that the Mongols could bleed could be outmaneuvered, could be defeated. This didn't mean the end of the Mongol Empire, which would continue to exist for centuries in various forms. But it did mean the end of its limitless expansion. Hulagu Khan, upon learning of the defeat, was furious. He planned several campaigns of revenge against the Mamluks, but the internal politics of the Mongol Empire in conflict with other khanates prevented him from mounting a full-scale invasion of Egypt. The Ilkhanate that Hulagu established in Persia and Mesopotamia would remain in intermittent conflict with the Mamluks for the next decades, but the border established after ʿAin Jalut remained essentially stable. The two states warred, negotiated, and sometimes even traded, but the Mongols were never able to reverse the outcome of that fateful battle in September 1260. The Mamluk victory had profound cultural and religious consequences. For the Islamic world, traumatized by the fall of Baghdad and the destruction of the Caliphate, ʿAin Jalut was a redemption. It demonstrated that God had not abandoned Muslims, that jihad could still be victorious against seemingly invincible enemies. The Mamluks became heroes throughout the Islamic world, celebrated in poems, chronicles, and folk tales. Baibars in particular became a near-legendary figure, the warrior sultan who had helped defeat the Mongols and then drive out the Crusaders. Stories of his exploits, some real and many exaggerated or invented, circulated for centuries. The battle also had significant implications for the region's Christians. Many local Christians, particularly Armenians and some Syrians, had initially collaborated with the Mongols, hoping they would destroy their Muslim rulers and perhaps restore Christian rule in the Holy Land. The fact that Kitbuka was Christian had encouraged these hopes. After ʿAin Jalut, these collaborators faced severe retaliation from the Mamluks. Christian communities were attacked, churches were destroyed, and many Christians were killed or forced to flee. Relations between Muslims and Christians in the Middle East, already strained by the Crusades, deteriorated further. The dream of a Mongol-Christian alliance against Islam died in the sands of ʿAin Jalut. For the remaining Crusader states along the Levantine coast, ʿAin Jalut was a disaster in disguise. Some Crusaders had secretly hoped that the Mongols would destroy Muslim power in the region, leaving them as the sole heirs. Instead, the Mamluks emerged as a dominant power and now turned their attention to eliminating the last vestiges of the Crusader presence. Baibars launched a series of brutally effective campaigns against Crusader cities and castles. Fortresses that had withstood generations of Muslim attacks fell to the Mamluk armies. Ənch was captured in 1268. Krak des Chevaliers, perhaps the largest Crusader castle, fell in 1271. The city of Acre, the last great Crusader stronghold, finally fell in 1291. With this, 200 years of Crusader presence in the Levant came to an end. The tactical and strategic lessons of ʿAin Jalut had been studied by military commanders for generations. The battle demonstrated the importance of understanding your enemy deeply, not only their strengths, but also their weaknesses. The Mamluks won because they did their homework. They studied how the Mongols fought, practiced against those tactics, and developed specific countermeasures. They chose a battlefield that neutralized the Mongol advantages and amplified their own. They used deception to lure the Mongols into a disadvantageous position. And when the moment of actual combat arrived, they had the skill, discipline, and morale to execute their plan. The battle also illustrated the importance of personal leadership. Both Kutus and Baibars did not command from a distance, but fought in the front lines alongside their men. In military cultures where honor and personal courage were highly valued, this mattered enormously. The Mamluk warriors were not simply following abstract orders. They were following leaders who shared their dangers. This personal connection between command and troops was a significant force multiplier, especially in a battle as desperate as ʿAin Jalut. Another fascinating aspect of the battle is how it demonstrates that even seemingly perfect military systems have vulnerabilities. The Mongol system of warfare had weaknesses. Their reliance on mobility meant that in confined terrain, they lost a crucial advantage. Their preference for avoiding prolonged battles of attrition meant that when forced into such combat, they had no inherent advantage. Their reliance on their reputation made them potentially vulnerable to deception. The Mamluks identified these vulnerabilities and exploited them brilliantly. It's also important to recognize the role of chance and circumstance at ʿAin Jalut. Had Hulagu not withdrawn most of his army due to the Mongolian succession crisis, the Mamluks would have faced a much larger force and the odds would have been dramatically different. Had Kitbuka been more cautious and refused to be drawn into the valley, the battle might never have unfolded on the terms that favored the Mamluks. Had any of the many small tactical decisions during the battle been different, the outcome might have changed. History often revolves around singular moments, and ʿAin Jalut was certainly one of those moments. The battle also reminds us that seemingly invincible empires and armies inevitably reach their limits. The Mongols had conquered the largest land empire in history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. They had destroyed ancient civilizations and rewritten the map of Eurasia. But even they could not conquer everything. Geography, logistics, internal politics, and finally the determined resistance of capable adversaries established limits that not even the Mongols could overcome. ʿAin Jalut was where the western limit of Mongol expansion was definitively marked. For Egypt specifically, ʿAin Jalut ensured its survival as a center of power and culture. Cairo did not share Baghdad's fate. It was not sacked and burned. Its population was not massacred. Its libraries and mosques were not destroyed. Instead, Cairo flourished under Mamluk rule, becoming the largest city in the Islamic world and a center of learning, commerce, and art. The magnificent mosques and madrasas that still adorn Cairo today are largely Mamluk legacies, built with a wealth and stability that ʿAin Jalut helped ensure. The memory of ʿAin Jalut remains powerful in the Arab and Islamic world today. The battle is seen as a symbol of resistance against impossible odds, of Islamic unity in the face of existential threats, and of the possibility of defeating seemingly invincible enemies through courage, strategy, and faith. In moments of crisis, Middle Eastern leaders often invoke ʿAin Jalut as an inspiring precedent. This is not always historically accurate or appropriate, but it speaks to the enduring power of narrative. It is fascinating to consider the parallels between the Mamluks and the Mongols. Both were in a sense product of the Eurasian steppes. The Mongols were nomads of the eastern steppes, while many Mamluks were originally Turkic peoples of the western steppes, the Caucasus, and surrounding regions. Both were military societies where martial skills were highly valued. Both were elite horsemen trained from childhood. On some level, ʿAin Jalut was a clash between two military systems derived from similar steppe cultures but that had evolved in different contexts. The Mongols retained a nomadic tribal organization adapted for conquest. The Mamluks had been incorporated into an Obanized Islamic state structure, but retained the warrior ethic and equestrian skills of their origins. The battle also highlights the importance of military professionalism. Both the Mamluks and Mongols were professional warriors in an era dominated by feudal levies and urban militias. They trained constantly, maintained strict discipline, and were organized into efficient command structures. This professionalism gave both sides enormous advantages over more amateur armies. When two such highly skilled professional armies clashed at ʿAin Jalut, the outcome was determined by strategy, leadership, and the specific circumstances of the battle, not by any overwhelming advantage on one side. We must also consider the human cost of ʿAin Jalut. Thousands of men died in that valley in a single day. Each of these men had stories, families, hopes, and dreams. The Mongol warriors who died had traveled thousands of miles from their steppe homes, crossed deserts and mountains, conquered cities and empires, only to fall in a valley in Palestine. The Mamluk warriors who died had been torn from their homelands as children, trained for years for this moment, and given their lives to protect their adopted homeland. Behind the grand narratives of empires and civilizational destinies lay thousands of individual tragedies. The battle also had consequences for the development of military technology. The Mamluks had demonstrated that highly trained cavalry archers could beat the Mongols at their own game. This validated continued investment in elite cavalry in the Middle East. However, ironically, within a few centuries, firearms would begin to fundamentally change the nature of warfare, eventually rendering even the best cavalry archers obsolete. The Ottomans who finally conquered the Mamluk Sultanate in 1517 won in part because they embraced gunpowder weapons. While the Mamluks continued to rely on their traditional cavalry tactics, the lesson of ʿAin Jalut about adapting and learning from enemies seems to have been forgotten by the descendants of the victors. The geography of ʿAin Jalut today is a stark contrast to the bloody events of 1260. The valley still exists, now part of Israel near the city of Afula. It is peaceful farmland, plantations, and fields where Mongol and Mamluk horsemen once clashed in mortal combat. There is no grand monument marking the site, no preserved battlefield like there is for Waterloo or Gettysburg. To most people who live or pass through the area, it is just another patch of northern Israel. But beneath that peaceful land lie the remains of thousands of warriors. And on that soil, the fate of civilizations was determined. The chronicles and historical sources about ʿAin Jalut come primarily from Arabic and Persian writers, as the Mongols of the time left no detailed written accounts of their own perspectives on the battle. This means that our understanding of the battle is filtered through the eyes of the victors and their historians. Chroniclers such as Baibars, al-Manshri, Ibn Taghr-Berdi, and others preserve memories of the battle, albeit writing years or decades after the events. Like all medieval historical sources, these should be read critically, recognizing biases, exaggerations, and a tendency to shape narratives for political and religious purposes. But even allowing for these limitations, the basic outline of ʿAin Jalut, a successful ambush by Mamluk forces that resulted in the destruction of a Mongol army, is well established. The battle is a reminder that history is not predetermined. In the mid-1260s, if you had asked any informed observer to predict the outcome of a Mongol-Mamluk confrontation, most would have bet on the Mongols. They had all the precedent on their side. But the Mamluks refused to accept the inevitable. They studied, planned, took risks, and fought, and against all odds, they won. This is a powerful lesson about human agency in history. Determination, intelligence, and courage can overcome what seem like impossible odds. ʿAin Jalut also illustrates the importance of leadership in critical moments. Kutus made extraordinarily risky decisions, executing the Mongol ambassadors, marching out of Egypt to meet the Mongols instead of trying to defend behind fortifications, and bringing back Baibars despite their rivalry. Any of these decisions could have ended in disaster. But Kutus understood that extraordinary circumstances call for extraordinary measures. He was willing to risk everything because he knew that playing it safe against the Mongols was only a slower path to defeat. Effective leaders in crisis are those who can assess situations clearly, make difficult decisions, and inspire others to follow them even when the path forward seems impossible. The battle also highlights the role of information and intelligence in warfare. The Mamluks understood their enemies because they studied them carefully. They knew how the Mongols fought, how they made decisions, and what tactics they used. This knowledge allowed them to create a strategy specifically designed to exploit Mongol weaknesses. In contrast, the Mongols appear to have underestimated their adversaries, treating the Mamluks as just another medieval army that would be easily defeated. This information asymmetry contributed to the outcome. In warfare, as in many human endeavors, knowledge is power. ʿAin Jalut was also a turning point for Mamluk identity. Before the battle, the Mamluks were a military elite who had seized power in Egypt, but their legitimacy was not fully established. After ʿAin Jalut, they were the saviors of Islam, the warriors who had done what no one else could, defeat the Mongols in open battle. This gave them prestige and legitimacy that helped cement their rule for centuries. Dramatic military victories have a way of conferring political legitimacy regardless of how the regime initially came to power. It's also interesting to ponder how the battle might have unfolded differently if various technologies or tactics had been available or employed differently. If the Mongols had brought more of their siege engines and artillery, might that have changed the dynamics? If the terrain had been more open, would the Mongols have had more room to maneuver and potentially turn the tide of the battle? If Hulagu had remained with his full army, would the Mamluks even have attempted to give battle? These counterfactual questions are speculative, but they help us understand how dependent the historical outcome truly was. The Battle of ʿAin Jalut remains relevant today, not only as history, but as a case study in strategy, leadership, and the dynamics of asymmetric conflict. When a seemingly invincible adversary is defeated by a seemingly weaker side through better strategy, knowledge of the enemy, and exploitation of geographic and psychological advantages, it offers lessons that transcend its specific historical context. Military analysts and historians still study ʿAin Jalut for these reasons. In conclusion, the secret weapon that destroyed the Mongol army at ʿAin Jalut was not a mysterious technology or new invention. It was something far more fundamental and powerful. It was deep knowledge of the enemy, carefully crafted strategy, courageous leadership, tactical excellence, clever use of terrain, and perhaps above all, unwavering determination. The Mamluks won because they refused to accept that the Mongols were invincible. They studied their adversaries, identified weaknesses, devised a plan to exploit those weaknesses, and executed that plan with exceptional skill and courage. The battle changed the course of history. It saved Egypt, protected the holy site of Islam, established the western limits of Mongol expansion, and shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility. It demonstrated that even the most formidable conquerors can be defeated when faced with opponents who are equally skilled, better prepared, and fighting on their own ground. The shockwaves of ʿAin Jalut reverberated for centuries, shaping the political, cultural, and religious development of the Middle East in ways we still feel today. So when we think of ʿAin Jalut, we should remember it not just as an ancient battle, but as a defining moment when human courage, intelligence, and determination changed what seemed like the inevitable course of history. It was a day when elite warriors clashed in a valley in Palestine and determined the fate of nations. It was a day the impossible happened, when the invincible Mongols finally met defeat, and the world was never the same again. For the Mamluk warriors who fought that day and for millions of Muslims who received news of the victory in the weeks and months that followed, ʿAin Jalut was seen as more than a military victory. It was a manifestation of divine will, proof that the Lord God had not abandoned the faithful in their darkest hour. When Kutu shouted "Wa Islama" in the heat of battle, it was not just a battle cry. It was an invocation of faith, a call to the Lord God to bear witness to the struggle of his people. For those who believed, the victory at ʿAin Jalut was not simply the result of superior strategy or martial skill, but a blessing granted by the Lord God to those who remained steadfast in their faith in the face of impossible odds. The spiritual dimension of the battle is integral to how it has been understood and remembered throughout the centuries, transforming it from a military event into a moment of profound religious significance. May each of us, regardless of our beliefs, find inspiration in the courage of those who face the impossible, trusting in their deepest convictions and the providence of the Lord God as they understood it, and prevailed against all odds.